In an upscale restaurant, a young boy in a wheelchair faces quiet humiliation from a careless waiter, and no one speaks up. But when Big Shaq overhears, he doesn't just step in, he changes everything. What happens next is a powerful lesson in respect that no one will forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Regent's Prime, an upscale restaurant where the clinking of silverware against fine china blended seamlessly with hushed conversations. The scent of seared steak and truffle butter lingered in the air, mixing with the soft hum of jazz from the live quartet in the corner. Big Shaq, the man who once dominated the basketball courts, sat at a spacious corner booth, his towering presence impossible to ignore. Despite his status, he was dressed casually, an oversized hoodie, loose jeans, and sneakers the size of small boats. Shaq wasn't one for flashy entrances, but his mere existence commanded attention. Some diners subtly angled their phones for a quick snap, while others whispered excitedly. A few well-dressed businessmen threw casual nods of acknowledgement, though they wouldn't dare interrupt his meal. He had come here for peace, a rare moment away from the noise of fame, of constant handshakes and requests for selfies. Yet not everyone was impressed. Lauren, a young, sharply dressed waitress, maneuvered through the tables with an air of confidence that leaned toward arrogance. She was efficient, no doubt, but her eyes held a certain calculation, a quick assessment of which guests deserved her best service and which ones could be treated as mere obligations. A group of executives at table 7? Priority. The elderly couple in the back? Forgettable. And Shaq? Just another celebrity, one she had learned to ignore unless a hefty tip was guaranteed. She approached his table briskly, flashing a tight smile. "Welcome to Regent's Prime. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Shaq glanced up, his deep voice calm. "Just water, please." Lauren barely nodded before turning away, already focused on the next high-profile table. Shaq didn't mind. He had been treated worse in places far grander than this. He leaned back, observing the restaurant, watching how money and status dictated invisible hierarchies. Then the door swung open, and the shift was almost imperceptible. But Shaq caught it. A woman walked in, pushing a wheelchair with careful precision. Seated in it was a boy, no older than 10, his thin frame wrapped in a well-worn hoodie, his bright eyes scanning the room. There was an innocent excitement about him, the kind that hadn't yet been dimmed by the world's cruelty. His mother, on the other hand, carried the weight of reality on her shoulders. Her clothes were neat but modest, her posture straight but tired. She had been here before, in places like this, where the stares lingered a beat too long, where politeness felt more like pity than courtesy. Shaq noticed how the hostess hesitated, a flicker of doubt before forcing a rehearsed smile. Right this way. They were led to a table not far from his own, tucked slightly to the side as if to keep them out of immediate view. Shaq didn't miss the way Lauren's expression shifted when she saw them. A small, almost imperceptible downturn of her lips. The restaurant's atmosphere had been warm moments ago, but now it felt different. Lauren approached their table, her tone void of the fake charm she had used moments earlier. "What can I get you?" The boy, eager, flipped through the menu. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. Perhaps a condition. Perhaps years of feeling like he had to tread carefully through life. Can I get the..." Lauren cut him off with an impatient sigh. "Do you know what you want, or should I come back later?" The mother's spine stiffened. "He's ready to order." Shaq watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He had seen moments like this before, disguised as impatience, masked as professionalism, but rooted in something uglier. The boy's enthusiasm dimmed just a little. He lowered his gaze, shoulders curling inward. He had felt this before, too. "Right," Lauren said, scribbling on her notepad without really looking at them. "And for you?" The mother kept her voice steady. "The same for me." Lauren gave a quick nod and walked away without another word. Shaq exhaled slowly, a habit from years of learning when to step in and when to let moments unfold. But something about this wasn't sitting right. Across the room, A group of wealthy patrons laughed loudly, their expensive watches catching the light as they raised their glasses for a toast. They were oblivious to the quiet battle happening just a few feet away. A battle the boy had fought many times before. The restaurant had returned to its rhythm, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But Big Shaq had seen everything, and he wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. The restaurant hummed with the quiet symphony of wealth, crisp white napkins unfolding, polished forks scraping against porcelain, and the occasional pop of a champagne cork. It was a world where status was unspoken, but clearly understood. A world where, if you didn't fit, the walls had a way of closing in on you. The boy felt it immediately. From the moment his mother wheeled him inside, he sensed the shift. Not loud, not obvious, but real. A lingering glance here, a quick whisper there, a stiff nod from a waiter pretending not to stare. He had lived through it before, in restaurants, stores, schools. Spaces where he wasn't quite welcome, but wasn't outright told to leave. But today, he didn't care. Today, Big Shaq was here. He had seen him the moment they entered, a mountain of a man sitting just across the room. Even in a sea of finely dressed guests, Shaq was unmistakable. His massive frame, his effortless cool, the way his presence seemed to make everything around him shrink. The boy had grown up watching clips of Shaq on his old tablet, learning every stat, every highlight, every interview. To him, Shaq wasn't just a legend. He was proof that being different didn't mean being lesser. He wanted to go up to him, to say something, anything. But his fingers curled against his hoodie sleeves, doubt settling in. Why would Shaq notice him? His mother sensed his hesitation. She always did. She gave his shoulder a light squeeze as she wheeled him to their table near the back, far from the main crowd. "Just breathe, baby," she whispered. The boy nodded, trying to ignore the glances that followed them. At first, everything seemed okay. The restaurant was beautiful, the kind of place they never went to, with chandeliers dripping crystals and plates that probably cost more than their rent. He traced the linen napkin on his lap, his excitement battling with the familiar weight of feeling out of place. And then, the waiter came back. Lauren. She had been uninterested before, but now, her expression hardened as she approached their table. A tight, forced smile. A glance at the wheelchair, quick and dismissive. The boy kept his head down, but he felt it. "Ready to order?" Her voice was clipped, efficient, the warmth she had used at other tables noticeably absent. The boy hesitated, his fingers brushing the menu, his excitement dimming slightly. Can I get the, His voice wavered, his tongue stumbling over the words. Lauren let out a small sigh, barely noticeable, but he noticed. His mother's jaw tightened. "Take your time, honey." The boy swallowed and tried again. "The, chicken strips, please." Lauren wrote it down without looking at him. "And to drink?" "Just water," he said softly. "And you?" Lauren turned to the boy's mother, already impatient. "I'll have the same," she said, her tone measured, her gaze sharp. Lauren nodded once, already turning away before the mother spoke again. "Excuse me?" Lauren halted, barely masking her irritation. "Yes? Could we get some extra napkins?" A pause. It was a simple request, something she had provided effortlessly at other tables. But now she hesitated. "We're a little short on those today," she said, her voice smooth but dismissive. The mother's eyes didn't move. "Right." Lauren didn't wait for a response. She was gone, disappearing into the kitchen, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. The boy kept his gaze locked on the table. He had lost count of how many times this had happened. Little things, small slights that weren't loud enough to call out but sharp enough to leave a mark. And Shaq had seen everything. From his table, he had watched the entire exchange unfold. The way Lauren's body language shifted, the barely hidden disinterest in her eyes. He had seen the way the boy's shoulders curled inward, the way his mother swallowed down frustration, her hands tightening against the armrests of his wheelchair. Shaq knew that kind of tension well. He had grown up feeling it, in locker rooms, in meetings, in places where he wasn't supposed to belong. It wasn't just about racism. It was about power. and Shaq wasn't the type to sit back when power was being misused. He leaned back in his seat, watching, waiting. The restaurant continued on, oblivious to the battle that had just taken place at the corner table. A group of businessmen laughed loudly at the bar. A couple on their third date clinked wine glasses. A waiter brought out a sizzling steak to table 5 with a flourish. Life moved on. But not for the boy. His excitement was gone now, replaced by something else. He glanced at Shaq again, wondering if someone like him ever had to deal with things like this. If only he knew. The minutes ticked by. The boy shifted in his chair, stealing glances toward the kitchen. Where was their food? Lauren reappeared, but this time she was all smiles. Only, the smile wasn't for them. At a nearby table, a man in an expensive suit raised a hand, calling her over. Lauren's entire demeanor changed. Her posture straightened, her voice softened into something close to charm. She leaned in as she took his order, laughing at something he said. When she returned with his drink, she placed it down with an effortless grace, her fingers barely brushing the glass as if delivering a delicate gift. Shaq watched as her eyes flickered toward the boy's table, as if debating whether to acknowledge them at all. Then finally, she walked over, balancing a tray with their food. The plate landed in front of the boy with a slight clatter, not slammed, but not placed carefully either. "Enjoy," she said flatly, already turning away. His mother exhaled slowly. She didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes was clear. She wanted to. She had spent years biting her tongue, picking her battles, choosing between dignity and exhaustion. Not today. She pushed her chair back slightly. "Excuse me." Lauren turned, barely masking her impatience. "Yes." "You forgot his drink," the mother said, her voice polite but firm. Lauren blinked, then glanced at the tray in her hand. Sure enough, the boy's water was still there. Instead of apologizing, she let out a small huff, grabbed the glass, and set it down just a little too hard. A few drops spilled onto the table. The boy flinched. Shaq saw it. And that was it. The restaurant had gone back to its pleasant hum. The other guests had long since moved on. But Big Shaq hadn't. From his seat, he slowly set down his own glass of water, his fingers wrapping around the rim. His massive frame shifted, his movements deliberate as he turned his full attention toward the small table in the corner. The boy, his mother, the careless waiter who had just walked away without a second glance. The boy might not have had the power to change this moment, but Shaq did, and he was about to. The air inside Regent's Prime had a way of filtering out discomfort. Conversations layered over one another, polite and polished. Expensive perfume masked the scent of tension, and fine dining etiquette ensured that unpleasant moments were ignored rather than addressed. Lauren thrived in that environment. She moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone who had learned to categorize people within seconds. It was never blatant, never direct, but always there. A split-second calculation of who mattered and who didn't. And the boy in the wheelchair? He didn't matter. She approached his table again, arms crossed over her notepad, a single brow arched. "So, everything okay?" The boy hesitated before nodding. His mother, however, gave Lauren a long, measured look. "We're still waiting for the extra napkins." Lauren exhaled through her nose, like she had been asked for an impossible favor. "Right, I'll check." She didn't move. Instead, she glanced down at the boy's plate. He was holding his fork awkwardly, his fingers struggling with the grip. It was a small thing, but Lauren noticed, and she smirked. "You need some help with that, bud?" she asked, her voice just a little too sweet, the condescension creeping in at the edges. "I can cut it up for you if it's, too much." The words weren't outright cruel, but the boy still stiffened. His fingers tightened around the fork, and he lowered his head slightly. His mother's face went blank, not with shock but with exhaustion. She had fought too many of these battles before, and she knew exactly how they played out. Lauren wasn't done. "Or we have a kids' menu if that's easier," she added with a thin smile. "Some of the portions are smaller, more manageable." The boy didn't look up. The mother's jaw locked, her hands curled into fists on the table. Shaq saw everything. From his booth, he had been watching, waiting. He had seen the boy's excitement when he first walked in, the way his eyes had lit up when he spotted Shaq across the room. He had seen the slow unraveling of that joy, piece by piece, under Lauren's casual cruelty. And now? Now, Shaq's grip tightened around his fork. His massive frame remained still, but his knuckles whitened against the silverware. This wasn't going to slide. The mother's voice was quiet, but firm. He's fine with his meal. Lauren shrugged, unfazed. Okay, just thought I'd help. There was no sincerity in her voice, only dismissal. A few diners had noticed now. Some had caught the tail end of the exchange, their eyes flickering toward the table before quickly looking away. A man in a suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman near the window let out a quiet sigh, but no one said anything. It was easier that way. Shaq had seen it all before. He had felt that same silence in boardrooms, in locker rooms, in places where he was expected to just take it. Not today. Lauren gave one final half-hearted smile before turning away. And then, the glass tipped. The boy had been so focused on keeping his expression neutral, on keeping his hands steady, that his fingers twitched against his water glass. The cup wobbled, tilted, and spilled. Water splashed across the table, soaking the napkin, dripping down the side of his plate. It wasn't much, just a small accident, but Lauren reacted like he had flipped the entire table over. She whirled around at the sound, clicking her tongue as she approached. Oh, wow. The boy's face burned. It's fine, his mother said immediately, already reaching for the damp napkin. It's just water. Lauren sighed loudly. Yeah, but still. Let me get someone to clean it up before it spreads everywhere. She turned slightly, calling toward another waiter. Hey, can we get a towel over here? Had a little accident at this table. Little accident. The boy shrank. The words were harmless, on the surface. But the way she said them wasn't. The way she turned the minor spill into an inconvenience. The way she made sure other diners heard. Across the room, a businessman glanced over, shook his head slightly, and went back to his meal. A couple at the bar exchanged a quick glance. The jazz band kept playing, and Shaq had had enough. He placed his fork down gently, too gently. A stillness settled over his broad shoulders, the kind that only came before a storm. Lauren didn't notice. She was too busy pulling a towel from a nearby tray, shaking her head as she dabbed at the water like it was some major disruption to her night. You know, she mused, maybe next time, just be a little more careful. She gave the boy a tight plastic smile. It's okay though, accidents happen. The mother froze. Her breathing evened out, her hands still against the table. She had been in this position too many times before, in places just like this, where speaking up meant causing a scene and staying quiet meant swallowing pride. Shaq moved. He didn't rise quickly. He took his time, shifting in his seat, letting his full height stretch as he stood. The booth creaked under the weight he left behind. And now, he wasn't just a silent observer anymore. Heads turned, because when Big Shaq moved, people noticed. Lauren's back was still turned, but something in the air changed, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes landing on the towering figure now standing just a few feet away. Shaq wasn't glaring. He wasn't frowning. But the way he looked at her, calm, steady, unshaken, was enough to make her pause. The restaurant stilled. The other diners who had been so determined to ignore what was happening now found themselves watching. Some tried to act like they weren't paying attention, stirring their drinks, glancing down at their plates. But they were listening. Lauren swallowed. Mr. O'Neill, can I get you something? Shaq didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the table, the damp napkins, the boy's still expression, the mother's clenched hands. Then finally he spoke. Yeah, he said, his voice smooth but firm. You can start by bringing them those extra napkins. Lauren blinked. A second passed, then another. Of course, she said quickly, trying to regain composure. I was just about to... I know, Shaq said, his tone never changing. That's why I'm reminding you. Lauren froze, and the restaurant wasn't buzzing anymore. It was watching. The weight of the moment settled over her shoulders. For the first time all night, she wasn't in control of the conversation. She gave a stiff nod and hurried toward the service station, disappearing into the back. The moment stretched, silent and heavy, before Shaq finally turned his gaze to the boy. The kid was staring at him, wide-eyed, frozen. Shaq offered him a small nod, just a simple gesture, the kind that said, "I saw that. I saw you." The boy didn't say a word, but his fingers uncurled just slightly from where they had been gripping his hoodie. And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. Lauren returned to the table with 2 plates balanced effortlessly on her arms, her steps measured, her expression cool. The restaurant had settled back into its quiet murmur, but a new energy simmered beneath the surface, an awareness that something was about to unfold. She placed the boy's plate down first, not carefully, not aggressively, but with a certain sharpness, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. The chicken strips landed with a faint clatter against the plate. The napkin, one of the few she had bothered to bring, barely keeping the condensation from the drink from soaking into the table. "Here you go, bud," she said, her voice laced with a thin veneer of politeness, the kind people used when they wanted to make it clear they were being forced to be nice. The boy hesitated before reaching for his fork. Lauren turned to his mother, setting her plate down with the same deliberate edge. Then, as if an afterthought, she let out a small laugh. "You know," she mused, "I was just saying to one of my coworkers, it's so nice to see people like you coming to places like this." The words seemed harmless enough, but the weight behind them was anything but. People like you. The mother froze. The boy stopped mid-motion, his fingers barely brushing against the silverware. He had heard words like that before, always in soft tones, always hidden behind fake smiles. A few nearby diners paused. A woman at a corner table glanced up, her lips parting slightly before she looked away. The businessman who had ignored the earlier interaction shifted uncomfortably in his chair. No one spoke. Lauren just smiled. "Enjoy your meal." And that was it. That was the moment. The slow, creeping humiliation boiled over. The mother exhaled sharply, not in defeat, in decision. She pushed her chair back slightly, her movements calm but deliberate. Her eyes locked onto Lauren's. "I need you to say that again." Lauren blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" "You heard me?" the mother said, her voice smooth as glass. "Say it again, clearly this time." Lauren gave a tight-lipped smile. "I was just being polite, ma'am." "No," the mother said, tilting her head. "You weren't." Tension snapped into the air like a pulled wire. The boy swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the hem of his hoodie. He had seen his mother handle moments like this before. Always careful, always measured, because the world didn't give women like her the luxury of losing control. But today, she wasn't backing down. Lauren, however, didn't flinch. "I really don't see what the problem is." The mother leaned forward slightly. "The problem is that my son and I don't need your approval to eat here." A flicker of something crossed Lauren's face, annoyance, maybe even amusement. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the air like a blade. Deep, steady, unmistakable. "You done?" The entire restaurant froze. Heads turned, forks halted mid-air, glasses were lowered. Shaquille O'Neal was standing, and he wasn't smiling. The sheer weight of his presence shifted the entire energy of the room. He wasn't just tall, he wasn't just famous, he was imposing. A force that demanded attention without raising his voice, without needing to. Lauren paled. "Mr. O'Neal," she started, but Shaq took a single step forward. "Let me ask again," he said, his voice slow, measured. "Are you done?" Lauren hesitated. The restaurant was dead silent now. Shaq's eyes never left hers. He wasn't glaring, he wasn't scowling, but the weight in his gaze was suffocating. Lauren swallowed. "I was just being polite," Shaq finished for her. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It reached every corner of the room, settling into every uneasy pause, pressing against every held breath. Lauren's lips parted, but no words came. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "That's funny." He leaned forward, resting one massive hand against the table. "Because what I heard was something else." Lauren's breath hitched. Shaq straightened, glancing around the restaurant. And I'm guessing everyone else heard it too. A few diners looked away, guilty. Others pretended to be focused on their food, but their ears were still locked in. Lauren stepped back. Shaq didn't move. So I'll ask one last time, he said, his voice lowering slightly, not in volume, in intensity. Are you done? The pause stretched too long. Lauren nodded stiffly. Yes. Good, Shaq said, exhaling slowly. Now go get their check. Lauren blinked. What? Shaq's gaze didn't waver. Get their check, he repeated, and bring it to me. Lauren hesitated. Now, Shaq said. She turned on her heel and rushed, toward the back. The restaurant remained eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after something unspoken had shifted. Shaq exhaled again, the tension in his shoulders easing as he looked down at the boy. Kid, he said, his voice softer now. The boy looked up. You good? Shaq asked. The boy hesitated. Then finally he nodded. Shaq nodded back. Good. The boy's fingers unclenched slightly from his hoodie. Lauren returned minutes later, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. She placed the check on the table, but Shaq was already reaching for his wallet. He pulled out his card, calmly placed it on the table and slid it forward. Put it on mine, he said. The mother's lips parted in protest, but Shaq shook his head. You're not paying for this, he said simply. And that was final. Lauren picked up the card and left without another word. The restaurant breathed again. Conversations slowly resumed, though not without stolen glances toward Shaq's table. Shaq, however, was already sitting back down, reaching for his drink like nothing had happened. The boy glanced at his mother, then at Shaq, then back at his plate. He didn't say thank you. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because he knew Shaq hadn't done it for thanks. Shaq had done it because it was right. Lauren returned with the receipt, her movement stiff, her expression neutral. But the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. She placed the check on the table without a word, as if hoping that by staying quiet, the moment would pass. It wouldn't. Shaq didn't reach for the receipt right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his massive forearms on the table, his fingers interlocked. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even stern. It was something far heavier. Disappointed. How long you been working here? Shaq asked, his voice steady. Lauren hesitated, then forced a small shrug. A while. Shaq nodded. You like it? She blinked. I mean, yeah, I guess. You guess? Shaq repeated, tilting his head. Lauren shifted her weight from one foot to the other, suddenly feeling very small. What's this about? She asked, trying to keep her tone even, but there was an edge of defensiveness creeping in. Shaq exhaled through his nose, then glanced at the boy, who was staring at his plate, pushing his food around with his fork. The mother's face was unreadable, but her fingers were still curled around the napkin in her lap, gripping it just a little too tightly. Shaq tapped his fingers against the table. Once. Twice. You ever been the smallest person in the room? He asked. Lauren frowned. What? The smallest, Shaq repeated. You ever walked into a place and felt like you didn't belong? She let out a soft, almost amused breath. I mean, sure, who hasn't? Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering her answer. Yeah, I get that. He paused. Except for me, it was never about height. Lauren's arms folded across her chest. I don't understand what this has to do with anything. Shaq tilted his head, studying her. Then, in a voice quiet but powerful, he said, I used to get laughed at too. The room, which had slowly begun to slip back into its normal rhythm, stilled again. Lauren blinked. The boy finally looked up. I was a big kid, bigger than everyone else, Shaq continued. But I was clumsy, had feet too big for my body, hands too big to hold anything right. People thought because I was tall, I had it easy. But you know what happens when you stand out? He let the question linger for a beat. People look for ways to remind you that you don't fit. Lauren's lips pressed together, but she didn't interrupt. Shaq exhaled, leaning back slightly. I was lucky. I had people who built me up. My mom. She didn't let me hang my head, not once. My coaches? They didn't let me quit. They taught me that being big wasn't enough. That being rich, being famous, none of that mattered if you weren't a good person first. He glanced at the boy again. I don't know what you see when you look at him, he said, his voice cool but sharp. But what I see a kid just trying to eat his food. I see a kid who's probably had people make him feel small more times than I can count. And the problem isn't just you. His eyes swept across the restaurant, catching the guilty, half-averted gazes of other diners. It's all of us. No one moved. Shaq looked back at Lauren. Respect ain't about who's got money, or who looks a certain way. Respect is about how you treat the people who can't do anything for you. Lauren's arms were still crossed, but her fingers curled slightly against her sleeves. She wanted to scoff, to roll her eyes, to walk away. But she couldn't, because Shaq wasn't just talking to her anymore. The weight of his words had spread across the room like a ripple in still water. At a nearby table, a man in an expensive suit exhaled through his nose, staring down at his drink like he was seeing himself for the first time. A woman in a tailored dress reached for her napkin, shifting uncomfortably. The couple at the bar, who had been whispering about the incident earlier, exchanged a glance, the kind that carried unspoken guilt. Shaq wasn't raising his voice, but everyone could feel it. Lauren swallowed. Her throat felt tight. I didn't mean... Shaq lifted a hand, stopping her. I know. That's the point. Lauren's breath hitched, because he wasn't yelling at her. He wasn't humiliating her. He was giving her a chance to be better. The boy's mother, who had been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but firm. Do you get it now? Lauren's gaze flickered toward her. The mother wasn't smug. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Lauren didn't nod, but she didn't look away either. Shaq finally leaned back, picking up the check and signing his name with smooth, effortless strokes. Then he reached for his wallet, pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills, and slid them across the table toward Lauren. Her eyes widened. I tip, Shaq said, his expression unreadable. Lauren's face burned. It ain't for what you did, Shaq cut in. It's for what you do next. Lauren stared at the bills. Her hands didn't move. Shaq stood, his massive frame eclipsing the light overhead. The boy craned his neck up, watching him like he had just seen something bigger than basketball. Shaq gave him a small nod. Eat up, kid. The boy nodded back. And then, without another word, Big Shaq walked out. The door closed behind him, but the room didn't return to normal. It couldn't, because no one would forget what had just happened. The restaurant was still. Lauren stood frozen near the table, her posture tense, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides. The weight of Shaq's words hadn't just landed. They had sunk in, seeping beneath the surface where she had spent years keeping things buried. She could feel the diners watching her. Some were pretending not to listen, stirring their drinks, shifting in their seats. But they were listening. Shaq didn't move, didn't tower over her in an intimidating way. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. His voice, when it came, was steady, not unkind, but firm. Why'd you do it? Lauren's throat went dry. Do what? She asked, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. Shaq didn't react to her tone. You know what? She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. Come on, man, I was just doing my job. Shaq tilted his head slightly. That what you tell yourself? Lauren's jaw clenched. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, her skin warming under the attention. She hated this, hated being the one on the spot. She had spent years making sure she was the one controlling the conversation, the one who set the rules. But now, she had nowhere to hide. Shaq didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle into the spaces between them. And that silence, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. Lauren swallowed, shifting her weight. She could have just walked away, could have muttered an apology, faked a smile, and gone back to pretending nothing had happened. But the boy was still sitting there. His mother was still watching her with that same quiet, steady gaze. And Lauren couldn't move. Her fingers curled into her sleeves, It was stupid, really, how fast everything had flipped. She exhaled slowly. Then finally she spoke. "You ever been broke?" Shaq blinked. He hadn't expected that. Lauren let out another laugh, but this one was different. Tired. I mean, really broke. Like choosing between paying rent or buying groceries broke. Shaq studied her. "Yeah," he said simply. "I have." Lauren hesitated. She hadn't expected that answer. She looked down at her hands. "I grew up with nothing," she said, voice quieter now. "Trailer park. 1 bedroom for me, my mom, and my little brother. Mom worked 2 jobs, still couldn't keep the power on half the time." She exhaled sharply. "And people treated us like we were trash because of it." Shaq didn't say anything. Lauren's gaze flickered toward the boy for a second before she looked away. "School was hell. The way kids look at you when they know you don't have money, it sticks with you. I got tired of feeling small. Tired of people acting like I was less just because I couldn't afford the right clothes, the right food, the right life." Her arms crossed over her chest. But it wasn't defiance this time. It was something closer to defense. "So yeah," she muttered. "I guess I learned real fast that it's better to be the one doing the judging than the one getting judged." Shaq nodded slowly. "That why you went after him?" He gestured toward the boy who was now staring at her, his wide eyes full of something Lauren couldn't place. She hesitated. "I wasn't going after anyone," she muttered. Shaq gave her a look. The kind that said, "Don't lie to me." Lauren sighed, rubbing her temple. "I don't know, okay? I saw him and..." She trailed off, her voice cracking just slightly. "I saw me." The words hung there, raw and exposed. She didn't mean to say it, didn't mean to admit it. But now, it was too late to take it back. Shaq's eyes softened, just a little. "And that made you angry?" Lauren swallowed. "I don't know." A weak laugh. "Maybe." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just a notch. "Pain doesn't justify cruelty. It never will." Lauren looked up at him. And there it was. That shift. A flicker of something real. Regret? Maybe. Or maybe just realization. Shaq didn't push her. Didn't tell her what to do next. He just let her feel it. Lauren's throat tightened. She looked at the boy again, but this time she really saw him. Not as a reflection of herself. Not as a reminder of the things she hated. But as a kid. A kid who just wanted to eat his meal in peace. She swallowed hard, then did something that surprised even herself. She turned to the boy's mother. "I'm sorry," she said. And this time, she meant it. The restaurant felt different now. It wasn't just about what had been said. It was about what had been heard. Before, silence had been a choice. It had been easier for the diners to pretend they didn't see what was happening, to focus on their wine, their steak, their conversations that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the moment that had just unfolded. But now the silence wasn't comfortable anymore. Lauren, the waiter who had once controlled the space with her cold, dismissive energy, was no longer the center of power. She stood stiffly near the boy's table, her arms crossed tightly over herself, her face pale with the weight of everything she had just admitted. She didn't argue. She didn't roll her eyes. She just stood there, her mind spinning. And then, someone spoke. A man near the bar, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, dressed in a crisp suit, cleared his throat. His voice was hesitant at first, like he wasn't sure if he should say anything, like he wasn't used to speaking up in moments like this. I know what that's like," he said finally. The boy's mother turned toward him, surprised. The man exhaled, rubbing his hands together before resting them on the table. "I grew up in a town where I was the only black kid in my class. Every day I had to prove I belonged, and every day there were people who told me I didn't." He let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Teachers, neighbors, even cashiers at the store. They never said it outright, but they made sure I felt it. Shaq nodded. He had lived that story too. The man looked at the boy now. "I just want you to know, you're not alone, kid." The boy's eyes widened slightly. Then, from another corner of the room, a woman, maybe in her 40s wearing a green dress, shifted in her chair, suddenly emboldened by the moment. "My sister uses a wheelchair," she said, her voice stronger than the man's. "I've lost count of how many times I've seen people treat her like she was a burden, like she was taking up space they didn't think she deserved." Her gaze flickered toward Lauren, but there was no hate in it, just understanding. "It's not okay. It never was." Lauren swallowed hard. The ripple was spreading. A waiter near the kitchen, one of Lauren's co-workers, shifted uncomfortably, then stepped forward. "One of my cousins is autistic," he said. "I used to go out with him and people would stare. They'd whisper, roll their eyes if he got too loud. I never knew what to say back then. I just kept my head down." His lips pressed together. "I shouldn't have." His words lingered. The room wasn't just watching now. It was feeling. The boy who had spent the last 20 minutes shrinking slowly lifted his head. He looked around the restaurant, at the man in the suit, at the woman in the green dress, at the young waiter who had just spoken up. He had walked into this restaurant thinking he was alone. Now, he wasn't so sure. The mother pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment, as if holding in the weight of all of it. She had spent so many years fighting battles in silence. Now, for the first time, the battle was being fought for her. She turned to Shaq, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Shaq, ever the gentle giant, just gave her a slow, knowing nod. "You don't gotta thank me." But she did. She had spent years teaching her son how to stand tall in a world that made him feel small. And today, someone else had stood up for him. Lauren, still standing there, exhaled shakily. Her chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on it. She wasn't the type to feel guilty. She had spent her life building walls. Walls that kept her safe, that kept her from feeling too much. But now, those walls had cracks. The words of the people in the room, their stories, their pain had slipped through. And there was no blocking them out. She needed to get out of there. Lauren's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat and took a step back. "I need a minute." No one stopped her as she turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant. But as she disappeared into the staff room, she wasn't running. She was thinking. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she liked what she saw in herself. The weight of the moment had settled into the restaurant, thick like humidity before a storm. Conversations had restarted, but they weren't the same. There was a quietness to them now, a thoughtfulness. Shaq, however, wasn't interested in the rest of the room anymore. His attention was on the boy. The kid was still sitting there, his small fingers resting lightly on the table. His food had gone cold, but he didn't seem to care. He was staring straight ahead, like he was replaying everything that had just happened in his mind, trying to figure out what it all meant. Shaq didn't sit back down. Instead, he took a step closer and knelt beside the boy's chair. Even crouched down, he was still enormous compared to the child. But now they were eye level. The boy blinked, surprised. "You good?" Shaq asked. His voice wasn't booming now. It was low, steady, just for the boy to hear. The kid hesitated, then nodded. Not as fast as before. Slower. More certain. Shaq studied him for a second, then said, "You know, people are always going to have something to say." He rested his forearm on his knee, keeping his voice calm. "You can't control that, but you can control what you do with it." The boy listened carefully, his fingers tightening slightly in his lap. Shaq gave a small shrug. "When I was your age, I was different too. Bigger than the other kids, I got made fun of a lot." He tilted his head slightly. "But you want to know what my mom told me?" The boy nodded again. Shaq smiled, just a little. "She said, if they're talking about you, it means you're important enough to notice." The boy stilled. Shaq tapped his own chest lightly. "And trust me, kid, you're important." For a long moment, the boy didn't say anything. He just looked at Shaq, really looked at him. Then, slowly, the tension in his shoulders unwound. He didn't need to say thank you. Shaq already knew. He gave the boy's shoulder a small squeeze, then straightened to his full height. The mother, still watching, let out a quiet breath, her eyes glassy. "I don't know how to—" You don't have to, Shaq cut in. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, slipping his black card onto the table with an ease that made it clear there would be no debate. The mother opened her mouth to protest, but Shaq just shook his head. You take care of him, he said simply. She swallowed, deeply moved. A few tables away, the businessman in the suit had been watching quietly. He reached for his own wallet, flagging down a waiter. Put their next meal on me, he murmured. The ripple was still spreading. Shaq didn't linger. He had never been the type to wait for applause. He turned, adjusting his jacket, and started toward the door. He had nearly reached it when a voice called out, louder than before. Thank you, Big Shaq. Shaq paused. A slow grin spread across his face. He turned slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder. The boy was sitting taller now. Shaq lifted a massive hand, gave him a simple thumbs up, then walked out the door. And inside that restaurant, something had changed. Not just for the boy, for everyone. Lauren pushed through the door to the staff break room and let it swing shut behind her. The dull hum of the restaurant faded, replaced by the soft buzz of a flickering fluorescent light overhead. She exhaled sharply and braced her hands against the sink, staring down at the rust-streaked porcelain. Her pulse was still unsteady, her body still tense from everything that had just happened. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to the mirror and froze. She had looked at herself in this mirror 1,000 times before, fixing her lipstick, adjusting her ponytail, making sure she looked presentable before stepping back onto the floor. But now, she didn't just see herself. She saw who she had been tonight. A woman who had let her own pain turn into something ugly. A woman who had looked at a child, a kid for God's sake, and seen him as something to dismiss. Someone to push down, just because it was easier than facing what was really wrong inside her. She gripped the edges of the sink harder, her knuckles turning white. For years, she had told herself that she was strong, because she didn't let anyone step on her. That being cold, being untouchable, was the only way to make sure no one could ever hurt her again. But tonight, Shaquille O'Neal had stood in front of her and shown her exactly what real strength looked like. And it wasn't cruelty. It wasn't indifference. It was kindness. Lauren swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold her own gaze in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, she didn't like what she saw. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to change. Out in the dining area, the energy had shifted. Where there had once been quiet judgment, there was now something else. Respect. It wasn't loud. It wasn't spoken. But it was there. The boy's mother straightened in her chair, letting out a slow breath as she glanced at her son. He still hadn't touched his food, but his posture had changed. He wasn't curling into himself anymore. He was sitting tall. She reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his. When he looked up at her, she smiled, soft but strong. Ready to go? She asked. The boy hesitated for only a second, then nodded. When they stood, they didn't rush. They didn't keep their heads down. They walked through the restaurant with pride. And as they passed, people noticed. A man who had kept quiet earlier gave them a small nod. A woman near the bar lifted her glass slightly, a silent toast to their dignity. The ripple that had started with Shaq had spread further than anyone could have expected. And it wasn't done yet. Outside, Shaq sat in the driver's seat of his car, the engine running in a steady, low hum. But he didn't drive away just yet. Instead, he glanced back at the restaurant through the rearview mirror, watching as the mother and son stepped out into the night air. They didn't notice him watching. They didn't need to. Shaq smiled slightly. Some moments don't need a spotlight. Some moments just need to happen. He shifted the car into gear, his massive hands gripping the wheel. As he pulled onto the road, the neon lights of the restaurant faded into the background. He had done what he came to do, because not all heroes wear capes. Some just wear size 22 shoes and walk with kindness. Some moments change people. Some stories leave a mark. What would you have done if you were in that restaurant? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? Kindness isn't just a word, it's a choice, a responsibility. Next time you see injustice, be the one who stands. Because the world doesn't change on its own. We change it.